Hi, everybody. We're so excited that you have joined this session today. We're with Gus Walker, and he's with Veritone, and he's going to be presenting on building trust in your AI. But before I turn it over to Gus and get started there, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping, and then I will do a quick introduction of Gus, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So we're so excited that you're here at this conference and at this session. As we say at the beginning of every session, this conference really is for you. So we want to make sure that you're getting the most out of it with the interaction with presenters and the content, and make sure that you really can get your questions answered. So all live sessions offer a way to post questions. Down below our video, you'll see that there's an Ask a Question feature. You can click on the Ask a Question button, and you can post your questions to the presenters. You can also upvote other questions that have been asked so that those questions can move to the top if you have a similar one, or if you like that question and you want to make sure that we get to it. All questions will be held until the end of the presentation, just so that we're not interrupting Gus, but feel free to ask your questions as they pop into your head during the presentation. The replay videos have a cool system where if you click on the question that's being asked, it will automatically fast forward you to that point in the replay, which is great, so that if you want to either replay just that one specific Q&A or jump right to it for any of these sessions, you can go ahead and do that. And then all questions will be monitored as well, just to make sure they are appropriate. In the question of maintaining maximum interaction between attendees and presenters, these events are held under Chatham House rule, which is that anybody who comes to a session or a meeting is free to use the information from the discussion, but you're just not allowed to reveal who made that comment unless you've gotten permission from them to do so. So all live sessions like this one are recorded and available for instant replay once the session wraps up. So within about 5 to 10 minutes after we end this session, it will be available. And as always, if you have any general questions about this event, we encourage you to go to the FAQ section. It's a great place to get most of your questions answered, or at least a great starting point. But now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Gus Walker. Gus Walker currently serves as a Senior Director of Product Management for Veritone, overseeing a business unit focused on providing AI products and services to law enforcement, legal, and government agencies. And Veritone is a sponsor of this event, so please make sure to thank them for helping make this event possible. Gus also spearheads efforts to develop a platform that can evaluate AI models across a spectrum of capabilities to provide accuracy and performance metrics, identifies their potential for bias, and help uncover model vulnerability. So we're really excited to have him with us here today to talk about how to build trust in your AI. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gus.
Hey, everybody. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you for having me. So today we're going to talk a little bit about trust in AI and how we here at Veritone are addressing that problem. So without further ado, I'm just going to kind of move over to our presentation slide here, and I'm going to talk a little bit over that. Start with what trust means to me and what trust means in terms of what we're trying to do in Veritone, and then dive into kind of how we're approaching and tackling that. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. So let's talk a little bit about trust. Trust is kind of a broad topic. We need it, and we encounter it in all aspects of our lives. We have trust in our relationships. We have trust. We need trust in our leadership decisions at work and in our government. Trust can be implicit, such as shared systems like air traffic control and the FDA. We just trust those things, that our food is going to be safe to consume, and that transportation is going to be monitored and looked after. Or it can be explicit, such as when you go to a website and you sign that, you check on that terms of services, or you're entering into a business agreement or other legal agreement and you're signing a contract. It can work on different levels, trust that is, depending on the severity of the outcomes that if it's violated. So more trust typically is required for decisions that are difficult to reverse. So for example, we require a high degree of trust in our medical professionals. We want those decision makers to be vetted. We want their ideas to be peer reviewed. We want them to, any recommendations they make for services to be have gone through clinical trials. And of course, we always reserve the right for a second or third opinion. In other aspects, we don't always need that much trust. So, for example, if you take a look at your any decisions that can be reversed, you take a look at your cell phone bill, right? You get that every week, you pay it, it's fine. Every once in a while, maybe the number spikes a little bit, and you call in, you can challenge it, you can reach out to that carrier, you can go through your usage, you can audit it, and you can verify their decision. And then if they overbilled you or something like that, we can undo that decision. So those kind of demonstrate different degrees of trust. So today we're going to be focusing on trust in AI. So AI is new, and like all new things, it induces a level of anxiety within everybody, sometimes even skepticism. So there's the additional layer of anxiety to AI in particular, because even its developers, even the data scientists, can sometimes struggle to understand how what they made works. How does this black box make its decisions? So like other technical innovations before it, we sense it'll have impact on all of our lives. It'll affect our food. It'll affect our finances. It'll affect our education. And like other levels of technology that we've encountered, our trust in it will mature over time. So if we take a look back at online banking and e-commerce, when I was younger, there was no way I was going to go online and do my banking. I just didn't trust it. There was no way I was going to order that book on Amazon and bring it in, because what if I couldn't return it? And so as these technologies matured and the policies around security and accountability increased, we became more comfortable with online banking. In fact, I imagine most of us do more of our banking online than actually going to the physical facility itself. And the same can be held true. The same holds true for e-commerce, right? Amazon worked really hard, and other e-commerce providers, on making returns easy, on combating or challenging the delivery of services that were substandard easy to do. And so because that problem was solved for us, we knew how to deal with it. It engendered more trust within us, and now a lot of us spend the bulk of our money online in online purchases, as opposed to, again, brick and mortar. So, and this will hold true for other technologies that are emerging as well. For example, teleeducation, which we're kind of being forced into with COVID, and telesurgery and things like that. So again, like these other technologies, I have a sense that as AI matures, as we get more familiar with it, as it becomes more ingrained in our lives, our trust will increase with it. But until we're there, what can we do about that? What can we do to foster trust in AI? As an organization, how can I, as a business, trust it so that it doesn't introduce unexpected challenges or risk? How can I, as the victim, or not the victim, but the recipient of its decisions, trust it as well? So, for example, if I apply for a loan, or if I'm trying to get into a college, or my children are, how do I trust that the decisions that are made, which are more and more being informed by AI, are going to be valid? And so, we want to be able to trust these things. Again, as employees as well, we can think of, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as I move through my presentation, AI is kind of a digital worker. How do I trust my digital worker? How do I foster, how do I create a relationship with them so I can reliably trust and expect that their decisions are useful and material to me, so that I can make further decisions on that? So as new technologies arrive, just as with AI, for example, we need to trust and verify. We need to ensure that there are safeguards in place. So for those of you who don't know about Veritone, as was mentioned earlier, we are developing, or have developed, an OS for AI. It supports a diverse, flexible ecosystem of cognitive engines, aka algorithms. And our goal is to allow our customers to focus on the areas of business that they provide core value on, and introduce AI in a reliable way. And so to that end, we started working on the product that I'm about to show you called Clarity. And it provides, as mentioned before, a platform to evaluate AI models across a spectrum of capabilities. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Establish accuracy, performance, and cost metrics. Interrogate them and investigate them a little bit for bias and variance, and we'll get into that. And try to better understand how their decisions work, not just when we're choosing our AI models, but once we've actually implemented them downstream. So, sorry here. So if we think about trust, ATAR Care is an interesting government agency that's kind of focused on this. trustworthiness obviously requires some prerequisites. In order for people to use stuff, they need to trust stuff. In order for people to incorporate in their life, they need to trust it. Things need to be accountable. We need to have oversight on them. We need to make sure that they're robust and safe and scalable. We need to make sure that their privacy is respected. We need to make sure that they're transparent. In order to introduce technologies like AI into our lives, we need to have these different components of its integration understood and shared. So DARPA is one of the groups that we draw a lot of inspiration from, and they define AI explainability in 3 parts: prediction accuracy. Is it actually telling me what I need it to tell me in the most accurate way? Decision understanding. How did it decide that that was the appropriate choice to make? And inspection and traceability. Can I go back and figure out how it got to the decision it made? And so that's what we're trying to satisfy with this Clarity project. So taking a broader step, the promise of AI is always that it will help take humans out of the decision-making loop. By that, I mean it can take these mundane, repetitive, or complex tasks, and we can outsource it to AI, and they can be the decision makers. But in order to do this, we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that manages the appropriate risk, the risk that it'll be introducing, and that we can evaluate it. So initially, we've got the humans in the loop. I'm making a decision on who to hire, what technologies to adopt, where to spend my money, and then we want the human on the loop. As I mentioned, the general decisions can be made by AI in a reliable way, and then the exceptions can come up to us, and then ultimately humans out of the loop, autonomous systems where I can rely on these systems to make appropriate decisions, and I can focus my attention elsewhere. So again, making the analogy from an AI model and an employee, just as when you bring a new employee into your business space, you're going to do a skills assessment, you're going to do a background check, you're going to make some scoring charts there, and you're going to review it with your colleagues and review it, and then you're going to bring them on. You're going to integrate them into your employment system, into your company and your company culture. The same holds true for AI algorithms. You want to evaluate them for accuracy, performance, and cost, as I mentioned. Do a little risk analysis. Are they biased? Are they subject to some certain vulnerabilities? And then measure this in a qualitative and quantitative fashion so that you can do some analysis, and then make sure that all leads to explainability and trust so that you can integrate them with your systems. Again, like an employee, once they're integrated into your system, you want to monitor them, right? So we're held accountable to our deliverables in the private sector with objectives and key results, OKRs, key performance indicators. We get annual performance or quarterly performance reviews. Wherever we're found lacking, sometimes we'll get some coaching and some remediation. And if an individual or an employee isn't quite up to snuff, then we can figure out how to augment or replace them. The same holds true again for an AI worker. We can start with that benchmarking, and then we can implement continuous monitoring so we can see how they behave on the job. And then where we find that the AI model perhaps drifts or isn't as accurate as we thought it would be in certain situations, we can introduce model training. And if necessary, the model is outdated or the conditions that it's evaluating have changed, we can upgrade or substitute the model with a new one. So as we know, virtually every industry is adopting AI, from e-commerce to government. And AI is not a cheap investment, at least at this point. It's a considerable investment. So that cost and complexity introduces the responsibility to make sure you're doing an appropriate evaluation of these models and integrating them into your system into your company, in such a way that they can be trusted and leveraged so that they don't introduce any kind of unintended consequences, as mentioned before. So, some of the risks are unmet expectations. I thought it was going to detect all the faces. Turns out it's not great at detecting these types of faces. Predictability. I know that if this is the type of a profile of a lender, a loan person coming in, I can figure out this would be the expected answer. And as I mentioned before, unintended consequences for AI decisions are important to understand because you are often required from a legal perspective or policy perspective to be able to explain your decisions to your people or to the people that are using your system. So we want to make sure that the systems are transparent as possible. So what types of risks can we introduce with AI when we bring it into our agencies and our businesses? Well, there could be issues with accuracy. So, for example, you are doing body cam recordings and you're transcribing those to share with the public. you got to make sure that those are accurate, that things aren't misspoken. And so if the model is inaccurate, then you have more work. You got to retranscribe that. It's going to introduce delays and costs to getting that information out to whoever needs it. Issues with bias. This is obviously very prevalent in the news right now, but being able to ensure that, for example, these facial recognition models are able to identify with equivalent accuracy different ethnicities, right? If not, then as we've seen, you can have some legal consequences, you can have some reputational consequences, financial consequences, and most recently we are seeing some states implementing blanket laws prohibiting their use at all. So these are some of the risks that could be introduced there. Variance. So this is a little bit more inside baseball. Again, I'm not a data scientist, but I work with a lot of data scientists. But variance is a type of risk that's introduced by how you train your model. So you could train a model that in such a way that it focuses on extraneous information that's been provided and uses that to make decisions. So for example, you have these credit applications coming in, and the model during training notices that applications for applicants born in even years tend to have a certain credit rating versus applicants who are born in odd years. Now, you and I, as people living in the real world, know that that should not have any bearing whatsoever on the decision of whether or not they get credit. But the AI model doesn't have that context, and so it just sees a correlation between that data point and the decisions, and so then it uses it to inform its model. We want to look out for that so that these sorts of things don't creep into our deployments. And then vulnerability, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but AI, in particular, visual systems, for example, are susceptible to certain types of exploitation that weren't available before. And again, we'll talk a bit about that. So let's talk about some best practices when we're implementing AI. We want to be able to effectively analyze that model and understand how it behaves. We want to be able to measure that in a consistent way, regardless of who provided the model, where it came from, etc. And we want to understand how and what influences the model's decisions. Why is it making the choices it's making, so that we can, minimize the negative impact of implementing AI and maximize the benefit. So to address these challenges, we have, as I mentioned, came up with a product called Veritone Clarity. It's still in development, but we're very close to general availability. So with this tool, we hope to foster trust in AI. We want you to be able to evaluate your models, monitor your models, and through those two practices, build trust in your models. Who needs this? Well, pretty much anybody who's going to be in contact with AI. You could be the data scientist developing your model, and you want to compare your model to its previous builds or to your competitors. A developer, you are building applications that are dependent on AI models. You want to make sure that the output of those AI models is suitable and appropriate for your application. The end users, I'm a person who is being impacted by the decisions of AI models. I need to understand how these models work so that I can trust it. And then the non-technical business decision makers as well. So maybe you're in legal, maybe you're in finance. You're still part of that decision-making process. To bring AI into your business, you need tools to be able to provide, to be able to enable you, perhaps a non-technical person, to make the appropriate decisions and recommendations. So we deliver value through clarity through the auditing. So we're going to assess the various variety of models. We're going to certify these models so that we can kind of establish baseline standards, so that as a consumer purchasing models or looking to integrate models, you can do an apples to apples comparison. And we're going to provide tools to continuously monitor these models even after the decision-making process, so that I can see, as I mentioned earlier, that my digital employee is continuing to provide the value that I hoped they would when I brought them on board. And then ultimately, whenever we find situations where they might not be performing as well, how can we analyze that? Understand, is the issue we're seeing a systemic issue, or is it an isolated blip, an anomaly, etc.? So how does it work? So we talked a little bit about the evaluation phase. So what we want to be able to do is provide scorecards. Regardless of where your model came from, IBM, homegrown internally, Amazon, whoever, I want to be able to provide my customers with a baseline scorecard so they can, as I said, do that apples to apples comparison. What is the accuracy of this model from this vendor versus this vendor? what is its processing time? Because those things matter. Cost. Perhaps you have a business situation or a government situation where accuracy isn't as paramount as cost. This is just going to be more of a recommendation system. You're available. You can use these policies. You're available for this grant versus a security system. I need to make sure that the person walking into this airport doesn't have a weapon with them. In that case, processing time and accuracy are paramount. In the latter case, cost is more paramount. Bias and variance, as I mentioned before. How can I get the totality of understanding of what this model behaves like? Vulnerability. Is this model susceptible to other people exploiting it in ways that I might not be familiar with, so that I can put risk mitigation strategies in place? And then explainability, so that I can understand what inputs, when sent to the model, will produce outputs that make sense to me, and I can explain that to my employees, to my partners, to my consumers, etc. We want to be able to provide, as I mentioned, to the non-technical users amongst us, the tools and the charts to be able to make these decisions. Now, if you're a data scientist, you can build these tools. These things are available to you on the platforms and workbenches that you use, or you can build it yourself because you probably have a pretty strong background in computer science. But again, for the non-technical users, the analysts, etc., I want to make sure that we're providing charts and other visualization tools so that you can see very, very easily what your model behaves like. And so we're seeing some charts here in front of us where we're looking at model attribute analysis. And in these charts, we happen to be comparing different models, but you could do this for a single model. Just one. I just want to see what attributes it has, how these different attributes are impacting the model, and then determining if there's any bias there. Does my transcription engine have problems detecting or writing down text from people who have a Southern accent versus a British accent versus an Australian accent? How can I understand what that impact is? Or the ambient sound during the recording? Is this studio recording, which is going to be pretty pristine? They got a nice mic in front of them, everything's kind of clear. Or is this a body cam or dash cam recording where there's background noise and passing traffic and crosstalk, et cetera, et cetera? So again, providing tools so that you can kind of peel away the layers a little bit, look inside these models and interrogate them to have a better understanding of how they make their decisions. So as mentioned before, we want to be able to provide these services regardless of where your model came from. Then we do this by leveraging Docker technology. Regardless of where your model came from, we are integrating it into a Docker container, and then we are having the output of your model adhere to our VTN standard. So what we did was we spent considerable time looking at the different capabilities that AI has, and then establishing some standards for the output of the expected output of these models. So when we Dockerize or onboard these models into this platform, to this tool, they are required as part of the onboarding process to emit their output in a consistent way. So again, if I have a face detection engine or a transcription engine from Amazon or Microsoft, or one that my internal data scientists built, I can do that apples to apples comparison. So obviously there's a lot of different capabilities that AI supports. We're going to start with some of the most common ones. We're starting with transcription, as I mentioned, translation, facial detection, on our roadmap, object detection, optical character recognition, and we'll have more and more added as the product matures and it evolves. So identifying issues of bias and vulnerability. How are we going to do that? I've talked a lot of bit about that. So what our objective is to generate these golden data sets. And by that, I mean, I want to provide a data set that has a variety of ethnicities, perhaps, if I'm doing face detection, with a variety of lighting. And I could use synthetic data to generate this data synthetically, or I can collect this information from extant data that I have. By labeling that information, and again, this is a process that's very similar to how engines are trained. We're doing it on the other side to evaluate them. I can then put that data set into the system, operate the engine model, and then look at the results. And now, from that ground truth data set, I can then make inferences. I was expecting there to be 10 African American faces detected. Were there? Model 1 detected 9, Model 2 detected 8. I was expecting the transcription results to be 90% accurate when the audio is pristine, and I expected it to be about 70% accurate when I've got background noise or crosstalkers. Again, I have a data set of that with ground truth of that information in. I can pass it through these models and look at the resulting analysis and make a determination of which model is appropriate for me. So some of the other risks we talked about, bias and variance. So it is almost an inevitability that your model will have bias. It's just intrinsic to how models are built right now. So as such, it's obviously important to understand the nature of that bias. So there is also an inverse or a direct relationship between bias and variance. Generality and specificity. So if you have if you work hard to decrease the variance, you're likely going to increase the bias. If you work hard to decrease the bias, you're going to have an increase in variance. So finding a model for your particular use case that finds that sweet spot is one of the pieces of information we want to be able to present to you. Model vulnerability and risk. So some of you may have heard some or read some of these news stories about these shirts you can buy that if you wear them, they fool the AI face detection algorithms, or sometimes they struggle with masks, etc. These new types of vulnerabilities are different than the types of vulnerabilities we would have found in the past in technology. In the past, maybe the developer introduced a bug, or maybe one of the dependent libraries had an issue with it. These types of vulnerabilities are intrinsic to the way the models work. They're looking in many instances, and not all of them, for particular patterns. And by overwhelming them with patterns or creating patterns that subvert their expectations, you can get around some of these models. So being able to identify that, and again, with these golden data sets, as I talked about, we can put this information into these models, run them, and then determine if they're doing the appropriate classification of the output of the image they're seeing, for example. Now, you've understood the risks, you've evaluated, how do you remediate these risks? What do you do about it? Well, there's a couple different actions. If this was an employee, as I mentioned earlier, we would send them to training, we would send them to the coursework, there'd be some kind of a policy and procedures in place that HR would run to help address that. In the AI world, you have a couple of options. The first one, if you happen to own the AI model and the technology behind it, is you can find out what it's vulnerable on, send it back to your data science team, and they can retrain your model and redeploy a better model. Now, some models are inherently trainable. They don't have to go back to a data science team. You might have a model that works to do transcription that might have heard a word that it doesn't know. And typically this is proper nouns, people's last names. So they had a model that knew understood the last name of the last Treasury Secretary. The new Treasury Secretary has a different name. All right, well, let's go into the model, turn it to training mode, and update it. Knowing which pieces of data it's struggling with is part of the output of this ongoing monitoring that we'll talk about in a minute. One of the other risks that it's inherent to AI models is drift. And there's different types of drift. So there's a concept drift. So perhaps your model was built to detect fraud, and it understands fraud that happens under these certain circumstances. Well, then your criminals, et cetera, become a little bit more sophisticated, and they can change how they can institute fraud. Well, now your model, because it hasn't evolved with the criminals, has a concept drift issue. There could be a data drift. Your model was a recommendation engine that was built for a certain scenario, a certain use case, a certain environment. You redeploy it into someplace where it's not quite familiar with, and suddenly it starts giving you weird information that doesn't make a lot of sense. So, for example, something that's it's seasonally inappropriate. This was a model that was made of a lot of data for swimsuits, for example, that are great in the summer, but then suddenly in December it's starting to recommend them. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Your model doesn't have, again, the context of what's happening around it, and so you can have data drift. And then upstream data changes. Perhaps your model was built for NOAA, for example, and is looking at climate issues, but it was expecting the temperatures to come in Celsius, and it's put into a system where the temperatures come in Fahrenheit. Obviously, you're going to get some issues there. So the ongoing monitoring of the models that we talk about will help us detect when there's drift. The analysis will help us detect what type of drift, and therefore we can make the appropriate recommendations or take the appropriate actions after that. So how do we integrate our system with external systems? Well, we have a low code technology called Automate, and through it, we are able to cognitively enable legacy systems. We can integrate it with your production system, monitor what comes out of your production system. When we compare it to the baseline of what we evaluated your model to, we can see if there's been any change in expected behavior. If that's the case, we're going to go into an analysis phase, determine what type of change we're seeing here, and then alert where appropriate the appropriate people so they can determine, all right, this model has a serious problem. We need to turn the system off and go back to our manual process. Or if this was an anomaly, let's go take a look at what data is being put in and address the problem that way. And in that way, we can again continuously foster trust in this model, not just at the selection time, but once it's out in the wild, so to speak, and operating. So that's the end of my presentation on Clarity. At this point, I'd love to open it up for questions.
All right, thanks, Gus. I know I have a whole bunch of questions. And if anybody in the audience has a question, feel free to type it in the Ask a Question feature. But, first, I'd really like to ask about, the topic was building trust in your AI. So at Cognilytica, I'm a managing partner and principal analyst at Cognilytica, which for people that don't know is an AI-focused research and advisory firm. So we always say, well, in order to help build trust, especially at the beginning, keep the human in the loop. So what are your thoughts around that? And what do you guys recommend to people?
So I think that's very important. One of the things we do here at Veritone is obviously cognitively ingest a lot of information for people. And then we produce reports that are available to our customers. Now, our customers can use those and then determine, oh, we've seen an accuracy dip and drop, bring a human back in the loop. One of the things I like to recommend to people who are building AI systems is it's intended to replace a human, but you should probably appropriately document that process. In the event that the technology doesn't work, there's a blip, you need something to roll back to. As I mentioned in one of those earlier slides, the journey towards the human totally out of the loop is the long-term goal. I think we're focused on that middle space here where I can have the human on the loop. I can have the low risk decisions that I'm fairly confident the AI is going to do very well, be handled by the AI, and anything that is outside of that AI's expertise or might cause it any issues is where I would set that information available to the human. So let the AI concentrate on the mundane, the boring, the repetitive, and let the humans handle the exception cases, but have that continuous monitoring system so that we can elevate any deviations in expected behavior.
Yeah, that's great. At Cognilytica, we talk about the 7 patterns of AI. And so everything that you're trying to do falls into one or more of the 7 patterns. And one of the patterns is autonomous systems. And we say that that's the hardest to execute and that there's levels of autonomy and that you don't go from 0 to 5. You incrementally get your way up there. And so it's great that you point that out because, even with autonomous vehicles, for example, the goal is to ultimately have a level 5 autonomous vehicle that can drive itself in any condition, day or night, on any type of road or terrain, just like a human would. You can go off-roading and do all that, which right now most vehicles cannot do. And so there's levels that you build into the system. Now, when you talk about autonomous vehicles, though, for example, we say that there are certain levels that are actually more dangerous than helpful, because if you don't drive very often and then you are expected to take over at those really critical situations, you don't have like those hours behind the wheel of you driving in good conditions, and now you're expected to drive in the absolute worst conditions, which doesn't always work. So bringing that into the technology platform and that aspect of it, what do you recommend for people? What's the level that you should keep the human in the loop? How do you say, okay, at this point I feel like you're ready to move forward? And you had also talked about how there's different, you have to constantly be monitoring your data too. And you brought up the example where maybe swimsuits shouldn't be recommended in the winter. Mm-hmm. And that's correct for, most of the Northern Hemisphere, right? So how do you bring all of that into consideration?
So I think what I would start with is the decision that the AI is going to make reversible? is the decision that the AI is going to make, will it be a life and death decision? If it's any of those two, for example, I'm going to be much more involved in monitoring that AI and keeping a very close eye. If it's a decision that can be reversed, for example, I didn't get the credit, they didn't get the loan because the system evaluated, and they can reverse that, that's fine. If it's an autonomous driving system, then I want to be a little bit more stringent. But I think we want to apply the same principles we do here in development. You're going to crawl, you're going to walk, you're going to run, but you have to go through those phases. You can't go from crawling to running without there being unintended consequences. Being able to engage with the users or the components that are going to be augmented by this AI is important. Again, if you consider the AI as a co-worker as opposed to an independent system, I think you'll find yourself in a better situation. You wouldn't go to work and just blindly trust everything that's going through. Every once in a while, you want to be able to vet, you're going to want to be able to talk, etc. That's what we're trying to do in a sort of a similar analogy here with AI. Now, as to autonomous cars, I know my mother's still expecting her Jetsons car. She hasn't gotten it yet. She's a little upset. But if we take the analogy from moving from horses to cars, there are certain things that horses still today do better than cars do. You don't take your horse into the Sierra Nevadas, but you will take your Tesla down the 405 on a day when there's not a lot of traffic, for example, and be okay. So understanding and making judicious decisions on when and where to apply AI and how much autonomy to get are things that obviously people may need to put a lot of consideration into. But my baseline recommendation is, if it's an irreversible decision, if it's a decision that could have life and death consequences, then you want to err on the side of having more humans available. Maybe they're just monitoring. And if it's one that's not, well, let the AI handle it, but then create mechanisms where those decisions can be reversed or interrogated so they can be relied upon.
Yeah, that's some great advice. Now, for companies and people that may be new on their AI journey, what are some recommendations and best practices that you've seen for them to build and put in place so that they can feel comfortable and build that trust with their AI?
Have a plan. AI has this seemingly incredible promise. We like to call it the magic bean sometimes. You put it in the ground, it's going to grow whatever you want. Well, the reality is that there are certain things that it does very well, and there are certain things that it's still learning to do. And understanding if your use case fits into the does very well or the bleeding edge is a big decision to make. In certain cases, yeah, being on that bleeding edge because it's going to give you a competitive advantage is the way to go, right? If you have the resources and the time to do that. If not, if you're just trying to look for immediate efficiencies, perhaps defer to the scenarios where AI is tried and proven, and you can reliably kind of implement that. The other thing to bear in mind is, again, I make the analogy for e-commerce to AI. Back in the day when e-commerce was new, you needed to know about web servers, you needed to know about cookies, you needed to know about the programming languages, all that stuff. Now it's a commodity. You go to WordPress, you can get it, you trust it, you throw it up there. AI is on a similar journey. Right now, we're in the early days where there's going to be a lot more interaction required from the adopters and deep thinking. And as those processes mature and become more hardened and more ubiquitous, then we'll go into sort of that self-serve model. So again, depending on your use case, that would determine your level of engagement of the AI adoption process. And then also having a good partner for that. One of the reasons that we feel that we're a useful utility for a lot of people is we don't lock you into anything. So again, with this agnostic model that we're talking about, if you've built your whole AI model, your whole application around a certain AI model, and that AI model for legislative reasons or technological reasons gets removed from you, you can find another equivalent one and integrate it, and the rest of your stack works. So being able to implement solutions like that is helpful. Our Automate product is another one that's helpful. You might not want to go do the complete investment in AI. You might want to just cognitively uplift stuff. You've got a lot of data in siloed systems. How can I get that out of there, apply AI to it, and do something else in a lightweight, light touch way? And so those are sort of the tools that we've developed that can help people move forward into into a broader AI landscape. Start simple, start with tried and true, and then extend into the more complex.
That's great advice. We always say start small, think big, iterate often. So you never want to start too big because it's too hard, honestly. And in order, the time that it takes is going to be incredible. And sometimes people just don't have that time and they need to see those small wins.
Yeah.
So that's why we say start small, but have the big picture in mind and then continue to iterate in an agile function so that, you're able to continue to move forward. Now, this is a data and AI conference. And I know you had touched upon some of that data. How do you recommend that users, especially if they're new to this, approach their data? And, we always say more is more, but that's not always the case. You don't always need more data to make some intelligent decisions. So how do you guys, help and recommend people get their data in a state for AI?
That's an excellent question. So data is the new oil in the AI frontier, right? That is the fuel that powers these models. That is the information that's coming in that makes them useful. Understanding what data you have to begin with is important. Understanding where that data is and how you can access it. And then, as you very correctly pointed out, culling that data down so you're limiting it to the most valuable information that's representative of the different scenarios that your model could be engaged in. There's often perhaps an over-reliance on publicly available data sets because that stuff's been pre-labeled, et cetera. That's good, except that that's sometimes generic, right? If you go, I've got a dog walking app and I want to be able to identify the dogs, I go pull the Kaggle data set with all the dogs in it. Great, but it might have a couple cats in there because that's not always guaranteed to be curated. Owning your own data, curating your own data, labeling it appropriately doesn't just give you an advantage in terms of understanding what you're trying to build, gives you an advantage, a competitive advantage in that companies that haven't done that have to do that before they even get to the AI component. So once you have that, you can keep building upon it. You get that kind of that moat effect. I've got my information. So maybe you're a tire manufacturer. I totally understand how they're made. I've documented all the different treads and where the treads wear and stuff like that. Now I've got this amazing data set to train this model. And then as more information comes in from the field, I can enrich that data set. But I've created that data labeling process flow. Now, there are companies out there and services. It's not necessarily something that we offer that will help you label your data. But getting that information organized, making it accessible, making it available to your AI partners, development partners is key. I think I heard a statistic where something like 80% of the data scientist's time is spent wrangling with data as opposed to fine-tuning those models. So if you can get out ahead of that, know where your data is, know what's valuable within it, and organize it and make it available in a labeled way, you'll be that much closer to the promise of AI.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, if anybody watching this live or watching this on replay has questions about data labeling, we encourage you to check out some of our fabulous sponsors for this event because some of them specialize in that. So I know Veritone doesn't, but we do have a few others that do. So we encourage you to check that out. And like Gus said, the data aspect of it isn't always that sexy aspect of it, but it is an incredibly important aspect of it, which is why we have an entire conference focused on that. And I think that you cannot underestimate how important it is to make sure that your data is in a usable state. So it was great that, you point that out. And throughout the entire session and all of the panels throughout the entire week and some of our on-demand content as well, we talk about all the different aspects of that data lifecycle. And it's important to make sure that you're managing it and keeping everything clean and updated and well labeled if needed. Now, we always talk about like do's and don'ts. And so you've shared some of the best practices that you've seen. Maybe can you share an example of a don't? Not a do, but a don't.
Sure. So a lot of companies will have a habit of getting over their skis. They'll invest heavily in AI. They'll bring in a data scientist. They'll bring in the data engineer, all that sort of stuff. And then there's that gap between when those people are effective and getting them the data that they need. They've gone out and hired the rock stars before they have all the stuff they need to work on. That's one don't. Make sure that you are crawling, walking, and running, because then you could inadvertently have a very expensive resources, very talented resources, idle or doing tasks that are not necessarily the most appropriate utilization of their skills. So that's one thing. The other thing is feeling that they can't be engaged in the AI model development system, right? There are a lot of AI model developers out there. I talk with them, and they are always eager for feedback. So being able to engage with them and understand that is great. Don't just take it that as tacit that whatever they give you is all you've got. You can engage with them. And if they're not the right one, there will be other ones that can engage. And the other thing is building systems that perhaps kind of give you lock-in, right? We want to build a system, and this is talking more about technology broadly, that gives you the flexibility so that as technology evolves, again, this is a new technology, you can grow with it. So that you have that for example, agnostic model implementation. You have consistent standards. Doing those things, more of do than a don't, makes your life a little bit easier. Makes it easier for you to get other people engaged in this. The other thing that's key is communication. Again, this is in many cases for some people a scary black box. Engaging early with your users, engaging early with your partners. This is what's coming. This is what we're hoping to resolve. This is our backup plan if it doesn't. Helps reduce their anxiety and helps against pushback against AI. Because there will be some entrenched interests that feel pretty anxious about it. Oh my goodness, it's going to take my job. I find that if you can frame the dialogue as, no, it's not going to take your job. It's going to make it so you can do your job better. You can do the things where we rely on your creativity, your ability for abstract thought. That's what AI can't do yet. So if I can take away the drudgery, the dull things, I can really get you excited about that. If you go in as AI is a solution, people then, their defenses come up and they're a little bit more resistant to it, and then it's harder to get it adopted appropriately.
That's another great point. We've seen that when you have some internal buy-in in it, it helps when it's a top-down approach, but that doesn't always work that way. You get much broader adoption. And I think that you're right. You need to reframe the discussion, and you need to not say, we always say that AI is not a job killer, but it's a job category killer, or it can sometimes take the work out of your job, where you don't want to do that repetitive, mundane, actions. And also there's some things that AI can just do better than humans. And that doesn't mean it's replacing your job. We say augmented intelligence. It allows you to do your job better. So it's great that you point that out. And, I think that what you've shared today really shows that, it's not saying, hey, this is replacing a human, this is replacing your job, we're going to cut our work staff by 10% or 15%. It's really saying, how can we use this to help us do better? How can we use this to help our company grow and move forward and get a competitive edge? So I think great points.
Yeah, I think that's very important to revisit. If we take a look back at it, people were fearful of the internet. Now, there are whole job categories that didn't exist before. Who knew you could be an influencer? Who knew you could have a Twitter following or a YouTube following? That's possible now because these new systems have come in. I am very excited to see what will develop as AI comes in and we can build new businesses and economies on top of that. So keeping your eye on the promise of AI without forgetting that other people are perhaps need assistance to come into that same mind space is very important. But the promise is there. I mean, we don't know, what the next influencer type job will be because AI is available.
Yeah, I totally agree. When sometimes people say, can you, picture the future? It's like, no, I wish I could, right? But I can only picture the future. When you watch the movie Back to the Future and you see what they predicted, it's really funny. They had fax machines and things that I'm like, well, that's because that was what the future that you envisioned looked like, because you couldn't imagine what it looked like otherwise, because it just wasn't there. So I agree with you. I think that is what AI will do. And we're really looking forward to kind of see what happens and see how it evolves. So Gus, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any parting words or a last comment you would like to share?
Just feel free to reach out to me. My information should be available if you have any questions or follow up. I'd be happy to share with you guys the progress of this product. And thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this and share my opinions and tell you a little bit about what we're doing as a company. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Gus. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you.